who are we and what do we do in the world of software computer consulting. If you go out to our website, obviously you can get more information, but we focus our time typically on very large projects. We do software modernization, obviously, technology assessments, as well as training and user research. Specifically, we spend our time in very complex business issues, whether today we'll talk a little bit about supply chain, software as a service companies, typically people that are serving very, very difficult kinds of business problems, which is fantastic news as we get into some of the open source, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the platforms today. But again, we do things in healthcare, we do things in supply chain, pretty much across any industry. There's very few industries that we haven't seen, including some of the newer ones now in cyber and threat, whether it's in three-letter acronyms for the government or banking, etc. And with that, we offer some toolkits, and that's what we really want to bring to you today is our experience in the market for things that we've seen to try and get those projects funded. So as we kick off now this business case for software modernization, there's a couple of concepts that we'll step into. Why do I need this so-called business case? I think we've all been in the meetings, whether you're a technology person or a business person, together stacking hands with business and the technology team to talk to executives. Perhaps you are the executive and you have to go talk to executive boards. The goal here is taking a solid business case, potentially putting some numbers behind an ROI, and then looking at a very specific capability for this piece of software, greatly enhance your capability to get your project funded. Some of the concepts that we're going to walk through today are going to be a little sticky in your personal organization. Some people take a hard or a soft view, if you will, on some of the topics that we're going to cover. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through them as food for thought, and as we get into the details towards the end, we'll have time for question and answer. Okay, so why is this business case ever so important? The first key here is just good business practice, which is the idea of distilling your business objectives, identifying potential short and long-term impacts based on modernizing your software, and then there's potentially a couple of different ways that we can look at this. We can either reduce cost, or we can create revenue generation, or potentially gap our product, and in some cases create a new roadmap for future funding or future products inside our business, or in some cases outside of our business. And really what we're trying to do then is create a concise map for these business objectives, and more importantly, one of the key items we're going to talk about today is why stakeholders matter so greatly in this process. Ultimately, this is a conversation with business stakeholders, whether it's IT or business. We're going to walk through 6 steps. When we walk through these steps, we'll then again sort of dive into the different topics. One of the big things that we do now is ultimately looking at your business. What is this piece of software, or in some cases a platform with multiple modules or software elements? What are we trying to do with the business? Where is our goal? Are we trying to cut costs? Are we trying to drive revenue? Are we trying to improve our customer experience? Or is this more of a competitive advantage? Is it time to leapfrog our competition? What's the market doing? What are my competitors doing? How do I make these changes today? And then finally, are our users happy? Ultimately, there are users, whether they are end users or my internal users. People use this software, and what is it we're trying to do? All of these go into the checklist that we'll go over today that really gives us this playbook or game plan that we're trying to put together. Okay, so as we get into these now, a couple of quick high-level items here, which is at the very beginning, how you hang this map is very important. So we want to be very concise. We want to make sure we identify any major gaps or deficiencies. In this case, we're looking at a cardiology type of a map. What we're trying to do now is don't solve the problem, but let's state what we're trying to do and be crisp and be clear. And we may have 1 or 2 of these, but you shouldn't have a rambling 100 bullet point type of an item. There should be some very specific outcomes. And the goal here, remember, is that this is the top-down view. This is something that we want to hang the rest of our project on. Okay? This is kind of a Mad Lib's view of this, which is in order to take this vision, we are going to talk about what our target audience, whether it's our end customer or our internal customer, be able to solve a specific problem or set of problems, and we're going to give them something that will actually create this measurable goal. And what we found then is when we work with our executive boards, when we're costing and funding and lots of words and numbers are flying around, it's very important to cling to this vision. And it's okay to make these changes, but it's very important to set this as a first guideline, because everything else will flow from this first vision. Okay? The other big key that we want to do here, which we talked about a few seconds ago, was this idea that today you have a piece of software. You may simply just want to migrate it and uplift it. That's part of the planning that you want to do. Do you want to simply enhance it, but today we don't, let's for instance have a mobile application? What are the kinds of things that we need to do to enhance? What are those additional functionalities that we have today to sort of broaden our horizon and potentially our product map? Or are we in the business of software, or are we in the business of competition, or what we're trying to do now is actually demonstrably shape our future, identify how we can drive or jump our competition. This will become part of the mix as we bake our cake as we move into this. Okay? The first step along the way is assess our current state. This is sometimes obvious, we hope, and sometimes a bit painful. This is some level looking in the mirror and trying to understand what it is that's going on that's out there. A couple of different categories that we might look into our assessment. And in many of our cases with many of our customers, we actually walk through this, and we'll see a spreadsheet towards the end here where we identify what these different categories actually look like. But the first is sales and marketing. The second is a user experience. The third is support. This could be call center or people on hold, or perhaps services people that are answering questions, etc. IT resources. Now we split IT up into the actual resources as well as the platform. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit of the current state. One of the big things we find our customers doing here, which is, are you losing revenue? Are you losing sales? Is your user adoption down? Typically, sales departments and marketing departments have a very specific win and loss ratio. They know when they've lost a new customer, and then specifically what customers they've lost to for application functionality. Is your software in Visual Basic and the new one is in React and other kinds of functionalities that are out there? The second big task item is that of churn. Churn is when you have customers a lot of times, or they go elsewhere. They find that your software is not flexible, it's not something that they can now work with, or something about the competitors has become more compelling. And it might be your internal users, right? So instead of using the piece of software that they use today, they could very well be using spreadsheets. They could be going back to Access database kinds of functionalities. The ability for these new features now, which is if you're selling software or you have modules or you're in the kinds of things where revenue matters, are there features? Are there things that are not going on for new sales that you're missing? The other one that we'll talk about here a little later is something called G2 Crowd. If you're in the business of software or you're in the industry of working with end user customers, G2 Crowd is a hidden source. This is the anti-Gartner, as I call it. This is where your users go to complain about your product, whether you know it or not. And one of the things that can happen here is if they give you heavy negativity, or in some cases on some of the other social media, that can actually directly impact your customer from buying your feature, function, software, or service. Do you have partners that are not reselling your product over someone else's product because your product is poorly written, because it doesn't have the functionality? We talked a little bit about some of this analyst vision. Does Gartner weigh into your view? Do you have these recommendations where customers are out looking for recommendations? How many of these magic quadrant features, if you will, are not being recommended? And then finally, your sales team. How many of your sales reps are fed up? Are they just walking out to say, hey, this software is just not flexible enough, I can't really sell it? Okay? So that's our first task for sales and marketing. Now we get into the next category, which is user experience. So whether or not your current system, internal or external, has become a Frankenstein. Do people spend far too much time inside of the application? Can they get their work done? Are there so many workarounds now that they actually work half the time out of your software or on these workarounds? How inadequate or communication-wise is this from a user interface? How old is your software? The next section is support. So again, whether you have a product that's outward facing or internal, how much time do you spend on this bad customer journey? Are these customers constantly dissatisfied? Are they mad about what they can or cannot do? Can directly affect your satisfaction, and then potentially now they're not a referenceable customer. And again, whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, the fact that you don't have a good referenceable base means that it impacts potential sales, potential revenue, or your user adoption goes way down, which ultimately comes to our next topic, which is now something for support. How many of these encounters are you currently supporting? How many FTEs and hours do you have? Are you spending more training your internal support team than you are the actual end user, simply because your software is out of date or functionalities are not easy to use? And then ultimately now this idea of a cross-sell. So if they're unhappy with the current software, they're certainly not going to buy new software or services as they come into it. And then for some of our folks that are in retail and other kinds of customers, are they just charging it back? They're spending a lot of money, you're spending a lot of money shipping products and those kinds of things simply because it turns right around and impacts your bottom line. The next one that we'll talk now, this one is an interesting one. And everyone here, and this is meant to be a joke, so joke warning on. This is not, in your business case, a way to say, haha, I'm in business and I'm going to go after those IT guys. I'm going to get a chance to cut down the FTEs, right? What we're looking for here now are logical kinds of things. Is the support cost going up? Meaning I'm on a Visual Basic application, an older application, and I'm constantly spending more and more time fixing it. Am I trying to do things like new features that just literally cannot be done? Does that mean that I don't have new features to sell to my customers because I'm so busy working around? New functionality, like technology that's in analytics or graph technology for executive dashboards, data mining and treasure mapping, are these functionalities just not part of the plan simply because the technology is too old? System performance, and being able to identify that performance. Has it come to a grinding stall? Does that mean that it takes too much time for the application to load? Is there too much going on behind the scenes? Skills gap. Heaven forbid, if now your old application is written in COBOL, or if it's written in, again, in Power Builder or FoxPro or Ruby on Rails, can you keep those skills in-house? Are you having to hire consultants to go do those kinds of things? And then finally, end-of-life software. What happens when your Visual Basic product runs out? What happens when you can't upgrade anymore? And then the most important one we'll talk a little bit more about, which is this idea of infrastructure. What is the cost for that infrastructure doing today? Can I go find that online or out in the cloud much cheaper? Chances are potentially yes. Now let's talk a little bit about some of those current platforms that you have today. One of the other items that happens in older legacy kinds of software, ones that need to be modernized, is this idea of an on-premise versus cloud. A lot of times what happens is we have a front-end software that perhaps was built in-house. Perhaps we purchased a license for Visual Basic or Power Builder. In other cases, we have .NET and other kinds of things that we've purchased licenses for. In some cases, we may even have middleware, which now things like Oracle or SQL or TIBCO for messaging. The point here is that all of these different softwares were typically built over time, whether it was in the client-server era or even in the earlier web era. These are softwares that today you're paying for. And what we see down here is we're paying typically an 18% maintenance fee, some percent for patch installation, and in some cases, this may be expensive consultants who have to come in each year and support or upgrade that software and continually back rev that platform that exists today. What we're trying to do now is let's try and put a finger on the cost here. Let's try and monetize as best we can what it is that you're paying for and where is the functionality inside of this platform. Okay. Now what we want to do is let's talk a little bit about the idea of determining how to monetize. You heard me talk about a few of the topics. In this case, let's talk about the idea of delaying a new product by 6 months. In this case, What we're saying is we have a new feature, a new function that we need to roll out, but instead of rolling it out on time, we may have 6 months where we may actually create a $600,000 potential sale to our new customers. Because we haven't been able to do this, and if we had newer systems, we should be able to recoup about 20% of that if we had newer technology and or newer systems. Therefore, in our ROI calculation, we would add $120,000 potentially to our first year cost gain. The other thing that we want to talk a little bit about is your company. Each company, depending on who and how your executives view these different sort of categories of the things I just walked through, may identify these as soft or hard. A hard ROI is something that's typically extremely tangible, very mathematical. Everyone nods their head and says, yes, that is absolutely a hard dollar that we can add to the bottom line or to the top line. A soft ROI is many times the one that everyone sort of shrugs their shoulders and says, you know, our GAAP accounting doesn't really accommodate that. Yeah, we can see that that particular one might be something where there could be a revenue impact, but not so much. One of the key things that we need to do by each customer, and each of you that are on today will have to ask your organization, what is a soft ROI? What is a hard ROI? What do those things mean in your own vocabulary? And what I've tried to do here is in some cases, these things can be up for discussion, and that's okay. The key here in this discussion is to try and have an open dialogue with the business and with the technology team to identify how modernization is really going to affect your organization. What we've said now, in some cases, some customers have hard satisfaction numbers where they can point to satisfaction, to new customer revenue, to cross-sell and upsell, and in some cases, that might be a hard ROI. Other customers, customer satisfaction, let's say in healthcare or others, it may be a soft ROI. It may mean that maybe I could sell some new software, but we really don't have that kind of measurement today. Customer churn. If customers have your software and they're no longer using your software, that's typically a very hard kind of a number. Switching to a competitor, that can go either way as well, etc. And the whole point here now is as you start to add up these monetization elements, it's very important to identify which ones are soft and which ones are hard, because as we build our business case to go talk to our executives, we don't really want to spend our quality time sort of arguing what's a soft and hard ROI. We really want to try and focus on what's the new system going to do and how are we going to get there. Okay, so the next big category is the future state. In this case, we're going to cover some of the same categories, but we're going to notice a few things that add on top of this from what we're going to get in our future state. Same categories: sales, user experience, support, IT, and platform. Okay? In this case, is it the flip side? Meaning, now that I do have some of these new features, I do have these categories, am I going to drive user adoption up? Are these time to market kinds of elements, meaning if I can get it done 3 months earlier because of the new software, does that mean it's faster dollars to the bottom line? Your organization may see it as a revenue decrease in the previous category for what our current state was. Other companies may look at this and say, well, let's put this into the future state of what we're going to drive, whether it's revenue or cost. The other thing that we see down here is that idea of whether it's social or those kinds of things. So again, this category may vary depending on which customer type you're in. New product strategy. A lot of the kind of categories that we see in this new product is primarily what are these new functions that have not existed yet? What are some of the functions or features? We come down here to this, what we call feature mapping and cost balancing for value, which is that if I can create a new dashboard for my customer to look into multiple modules of a piece of software that I'm selling, what could I either sell to my customer that additional module? So maybe it's $1 per month per value. Maybe it's the ability to allow my customer to spend less time in the software to drive higher value. Those kinds of things are things that you need to sit down with your new product feature, and whether it's the business and technical, to try and get a monetization value for what those are. The other big thing that we see now are visualizations. We hear the word treasure map a lot. We hear the idea of trying to unlock the data, this concept of doing data mining, etc. Some of those kinds of things may be self-evident and some of them may not, but it's important to put a dollar, or at least to try and quantify what this new visualization means for executives and managements. The other big element now is this concept of paradigms. If I build this new feature or I upgrade this software, am I cutting my process time in half? How do I monetize that? Does that mean that now users of my software, and there's tens to hundreds or thousands of people who use my software, can get their job done quicker? What's the impact of that process? What's the impact for the people? And what's that impact to time to market? And then how does that make either my brand or internally my software to my market become better for the software? All of these elements now are things that you need to identify, if you can, for the future state. A couple of tips here now, which is identifying persona. Typically what happens now is when you really start to boil down who is it that's going to get this new modernized software, what are they going to get? A lot of times it's extremely helpful to send out surveys. They can be light surveys, they can be SurveyMonkey, they can be in-depth analysis, etc. But one classic way to do this is to ask them, what is it that they can do? Because a lot of times your own customer can tell you where they can save time, how they can save effort, and specifically how your software, when you modernize, can be the best it can possibly be. And it may not always be in cost savings or revenue generation. Okay. The other thing then is this idea of future state for data analytics and visualizations. Today, the idea or concept of dashboards and graph are all over the map. Lots of people are seeing hopes and dreams and visions, but very importantly, it's important to identify what is it you're looking for in the data. What is it you're trying to create insights for? And is it cutting costs, driving revenue, or is it allowing for real-time analytics? And it's okay in some cases here to not have an answer. You may not know whether this is a true monetization or it's actually a business value. This may be something that, again, when we talk here in a second, it may be something that is now time for you to go do a prototype to actually prove that kind of thing. But these are examples and some tips on what future state can really bring to bear. Okay, here's another example of dashboards. In this case, a customer did not have 3 different views of their dashboard. In their new product and modernization, one of the things that bubbled up was this concept of creating 3 different views. 3 different users don't have the same need and they don't have the same view of the data. In fact, it's role-based, etc., and that the amount of time that this can be, because they're role-based, really significantly cuts down on how much time they spend in the product and, quite frankly, their productivity. Okay, the final thing that we want to talk to now is in this future state, where is that idea of streamlining your customer? We talked a little bit about what it was going to look like, but what is that time saved when we streamline that workflow? When we come down for the customer support, how is it that increase of visibility, how much is that cost, instead of going up, is now going down? New ways for that interaction. Instead of having people on the phone, perhaps you can now have new product elements that have online chat, that have inline help. The ability to do tracking and measuring can demonstrably cut some of your costs and perhaps actually make your customer satisfaction go up. Okay? In the future state, one of the big things that I mentioned before was this idea of personnel and headcount cutting. Be careful. The idea of cutting people's jobs is really not what we're after in this modernization checklist. We're simply trying to find ways to increase revenue and to cut costs. We're really not looking to headhunt anyone's jobs and what those things are. So the real question now is, if we were looking into our IT group, what we're really trying to do is come up with the new support features, what is the system performance, and perhaps actually keep the skills and keep the people on the team. Okay. The next thing that we want to do is this idea of future state for the technology. Now we start to get into the idea of cloud platforms. This is a very interesting new world, and in our last webinar we talked a little bit about how these technologies can really affect the bottom line. We talk about software as a service. So many of the platforms now, whether it's hardware, software, virtual machines, can actually really get into cost advantages and disadvantages. We also have this combination of items where we have hosting and then on-premise. Some of these costs can actually be identified, and we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a second. The next step now is, how do we really monetize this and what is it we're trying to do with these line items as we start to put together our math model. So as we start putting together this concept, right, you've heard me walk through a lot of different line items. We started looking at whether it's sales, and then this concept of whether it's hard or soft. We're going to start to put together a spreadsheet. The goal here now is to really start to tabulate the different categories. What are those different elements that we might be able to save or drive costs with? There's this concept that we also will refer to here in a second, which is this total cost of ownership. If you are indeed moving from an on-premise to a cloud type of investment, you can actually come up with whether they're one-time costs or recurring costs. And the ROI payback time is something that we'll look at as well. Typically what we look at is what do you do in your first year may not be the same kinds of tasks that you actually save in the second and third years. All of that we can now put into a spreadsheet. And if you'll follow with me here, I've actually got an example. And in this case, what we did is we actually started to tabulate. And in this case, what I've done now is I've started to look at, in our first example in the sales and marketing category, if we do have some accurate retention, what I've seen now is I have roughly $20 million in new sales, and approximately 10% of those sales have been lost because our software is not competitive. I can then say over here, I can actually change that percentage and say, well, I think that my new software will actually give me a 10% boost of that percentage, and now I can get a line item. In this case, I can be a little bit more conservative and say it's really only going to give me roughly a 5% gain. What you're now realizing is the concept of what I'm doing is trying to tabulate those different categories we walked through. In this case, if I tried to win sales and I actually lost them, there's a hard cost for my sales and marketing team where they had to travel, had to do some marketing, etc. And so I'm simply categorizing what those revenues look like. The other thing is we now look at things like churn. Again, if I have $20 million of lost sales, then I can actually come in and say, hey, why did you leave on the way out the door? You know, your software wasn't up to date, time to modernize. I can then tabulate what that looks like. And again, I can give a percentage of what it would take to keep that improvement potentially if I do that. And so what I've done now is I've created several sections. So I have a section now for my sales and marketing. And as I walk through this now, you can see here's a section for what happens in my social reviews or bad Gartner reviews. And again, one of the hidden costs that we may have is I may lose top-line sales reps. The sales reps are frustrated, and I actually have to go out and hire them and potentially retrain them. And I can see that I have a cost there. The next section that we see is something under the support or the call center. In this case, what we're now doing is calculating what happens times the number of issues for people that are on the phone. How many days and how many hours and how many incidents do I have on the phone, and then how many human beings are actually supporting those. The other item then is when I come back and say, okay, can I decrease my support and what I'm doing as far as the time, I can actually go in and calculate that. Same kind of calculations for management. And then potentially I have down here, which is self-help. What happens if my new software has the ability out there for customers to go in and quickly answer their own questions, etc. Now, many of these categories, you may say, Scott, this doesn't really apply to me. The point of this then is if that's the case, you wouldn't have that item and I can simply zero those out, and that one does not apply to me. So the goal here again is to create a tabulation across the different categories, like I've done now here for IT as well. And you can see that I've put in some pricing, which is now reducing from my current on-premise, which is today I actually have some hardware and software. And what I'm going to do here is I pay 18% maintenance, and it looks like now when I switch over to a cloud-based, I think I can save about 30%. Okay, and as I roll through these different categories, you can see that I have a section for business and executive. The second item is now what we call our recurring savings. So how many of these items that I listed above, of this approximate $1.4 million in this case, would I actually see year over year? Is it a one-time savings or is it a multi-year savings? All I've done is I've simply captured my savings up at top, and in some cases if I say, you know what, I'm not going to have that savings down here, the goal is to basically capture those in a similar line item capacity. And now what I can see is in my different year over year, I have a lesser amount for years 2 through 3. Then what I've done in this case is I've assumed that I've switched over to the cloud, And now instead of paying for some of my hardware license, I'm actually then going to pay for the number of payees. And in this case, I'm actually going to upgrade the software more to a cloud-based kind of software. I may pay it on the number of people, may pay for by number of nodes, etc. But this is where I would put my new cloud costs. And in this case, I've calculated approximately a $700,000 payment. Okay. And then if there's any recurring costs, all of this is ultimately trying to get me to the calculation for what my first year calculation is. In this case, I'm saving approximately $758,000, and then cumulatively over the next couple of years, it starts to grow exponentially. Down here in the bottom is where I talk about what my quick payback is in months. And again, this is part of my business case. This is how I start to chat with executives and socialize the idea of what we're doing in modernizing our software. Now let's talk about a very important component, which is stakeholder vision match. This is where I start to get into the soft side. So now that I have my ROI, I have my freshly minted spreadsheet with lots of numbers, now I need to basically sit down and have a discussion. These groups may not, believe it or not, have the same project vision. So this modernization project may be viewed as cost cutting, maybe revenue generation, or somewhere in between. And the goal here is to identify what these different categories are, understand that each of them has a different view or lens that they're looking at your project for this modernization on. They could be product owners, they could be technology owners, etc. And in some cases, customers have customer council reps. Our goal here is to basically identify through vision match, and this could be potentially surveys, could be sending out some emails, it could be socializing in specific kinds of meetings to really get that to the table, because the most important element here is getting that vision match. So now that we have our calculation, we have our ROIs, we now have who our stakeholders are, and we've had some alignment, it's time to move towards our competition. Early on, when we identified if we're out to jump or leapfrog our competition, very important to see what the rest of the world is doing. Some of these things start to look at what's the industry doing. If I'm in supply chain or retail, what are my competitors doing? Where are they going? Is my competitor Amazon? What are they going to be doing soon? If I'm in healthcare, or whether it's science or some of the other kinds of things, that sector analysis, what is it those technology advances the other teams are doing? How are they cutting their costs and driving their revenue? These are very, very important kinds of things that will then give me potentially ammunition. And again, it may not be soft or hard, but it's the competitive analysis to say we really need to move towards this modernization to keep up. We talk a lot about multiple products. If you're one of the few people that are out there that have multiple products, you may be a leader in 2 or 3 of your products. You may be competing in a couple of your secondary products, and then you may actually be either behind or ultimately in a maintenance mode. The goal here is to create a total roadmap. Let's find the modernization plan where you may start with product A and F and then move to your product B and C in secondary fashion. It helps you then generate what this roadmap is instead of a big bang. Okay? You may even give some scoring for your different products. You may even look at the usefulness and this feedback from your crowds. The other thing is listen to your customers. They may tell you which products that you need to do sooner rather than later. And finally, I mentioned this concept of a G2 crowd. Just because you're in the Gartner quadrants may mean you're the exact opposite in your user's eyes. And if you haven't found who G2 crowd is, I suggest you do it soon, especially if you're in the software business, because this can mean everything. You'll notice these are in some cases the inverses of what the market leading and Gartner indices are. Okay, so now we're getting close. We're coming up on now the compilation. How do we get prepared for the big meeting? Okay, the first thing is let's walk through that vision statement. Let's make sure that's solid. Then we talk about whether we're cutting costs or driving revenue. And then the idea of monetizing. How do we take that now freshly minted spreadsheet, put it into English so that our stakeholders really understand what it is? And then this concept of competitive landscape. So now we have our 3 foundational elements. A lot of times this comes together in a PowerPoint. The other sort of key tip here is you don't want to go past typically 20 slides. You want to try and have as much detail as you can that may spawn secondary meetings. But really now you're getting ready and you're walking into the big meeting. Okay, the numbers. The key here is not to become combative when you're setting up these numbers and you're looking at what these are. These are all discussion points. In many cases, you may be surfacing things that haven't been found before. You may be finding pieces of data that are new or unknown. In that case, you want to try and present sort of what are those informational points, and let's share them with my constituents, in some cases ahead of time. That value mapping we talked about, sometimes the idea of whether it's hard or soft is going to come up in your meeting. And as we mentioned before, again, socializing this ahead of time of what are competitive features, what are those new products that are going to stop the churn, is really getting that competitive or stakeholder buy-in. Okay? Now that we have that vision, we're in that executive meeting, and now that we're there, in some cases, your executives will say, you know, that's great, this is fantastic, we see the light, except how do we put a sharper pencil point on this? How can we get closer to that information? How can we see it? That's where this idea of what a presentation starts to become. We here at Expero do this quite a bit. It's something we call a corner office demo, where it's typically a short burst. It's a 4 to 6 week kind of a prototype, and what we try and do then is glue that ROI, potentially a business or use case, taking some of those personas and creating exactly that. In this example, what we did was we built a very high impact 4-week kind of demonstration that shows what our new modern application is going to look like, how the user is going to navigate, and more importantly, what are those features and functions that were listed as high. And that's the key here, is show me. Everything goes better with a good demonstration. Some cases, your constituents and your value map may drive you right to product development. In some cases, this interim step of a prototype is a fantastic way to bridge that gap. Okay? Once you have that, typically these prototypes are 4 to 6 weeks. They're rapid validation of your business case. You may have put down some elements in your business case that you now need to validate with your end users or your internal users. And then in some cases, there's data. There's a performance aspect or maybe a platform modification in your modernization plan that you need to prove. And a lot of these things can really come to a fantastic result with a good vision, and specifically for a prototype. Okay? With that, that's what we have. Covered an awful lot of information today. Thanks for sticking with us. And with that, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Okay. Oh, it looks like I got one a minute ago that says, how does this type of calculation vary by industry? My company is in the supply chain industry.
Okay, great question. One of the items that we mentioned previously when we were looking at either cutting costs or driving revenue, in some cases, if you're in a specific industry, there may be something that your software is doing that is unique. So whether it's a certain type of value. In supply chain, it might be something like logistics. Specifically, if we can build or modernize a new application for logistics, we can start to see information for impact of a particular part that may be part of a bill of material that impacts now my end product. It may be shipping, it may impact in back orders, and it may manifest itself in something like returns or chargebacks. So again, that modernization capability to be able to have software, to be able to show a dashboard perhaps, which is a functionality you don't have today, or potentially even building analytics, again, in modernizing your software. So again, you have to take into effect your particular industry, and then as we talked about, whether it's cutting costs or driving revenue, is really putting a specific point on what that is for that feature in your industry. Good question.
All right, I have another one here. You mentioned prototype earlier. Could you give me an example of how this could actually help?
Sure. So when we talk about prototypes, some of the functionalities when we talk about modernization today can take or manifest many different things. We've had a couple of customers, for example, that's using Visual Basic today. One of the core elements in their architecture is they don't have a data model or a data mart where they can actually do holistic reporting or analytics. So one of the things that they want to do in their modernization is create a dashboard. This dashboard allows users to build their own custom reports to look at sales or impacts of previous sales for certain categories of customers. A second version of how that prototype can work is potentially building that rapid prototype, showing what that dashboard would look like, getting the users who would use those analytics and categories of functionalities together. The second big element that we can potentially do is something like a graph technology, which is technology many people don't have today, where we can actually do analytics. We can look at impacts visually and do things that we haven't been able to do before and unlock some of these treasure maps, if you will. So using data now in that prototype is terribly important.
Awesome. I do have one more here. What are common objections you've heard when it comes to talking to stakeholders and everything else involved in getting funded?
Great question. This now comes back to the art or the science of what an ROI or business case is. It all comes down to the conversation between business and IT. Most commonly, the objection is whether it's a hard or a soft ROI. The goal here is to have the conversation. You can't dig in one way or the other because your organization will absolutely vary based specifically on what your business is and whether or not what you're trying to modernize could be a hard or soft ROI. The goal is to try and create an exhaustive list of conversational topics. So again, those objections are hard or soft really can't become religious points internally, but more conversational points to try and get your point across so that you can get your project funded.